The heart of the class is care and love. That is our main power for bringing us together and organising alternative social relations to the social relations of capital.
Mutual, la, mutual, la. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
Residents across Victoria and South Australia are being urged to remain vigilant as extreme fire conditions threaten both states.
Downgraded and lost cyclone status. 100km/h winds have torn roofs off homes and intense rainfall has swamped the region.
These are tough times, but Australians are tough people.
We are recording this podcast on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge their continuing struggle for justice and ongoing sovereignty in this place. You're probably listening on unceded lands yourself, all across the colony of so-called Australia. The folks who are here first, who are still here, have been fighting the colonial capitalist structures that we talk about in this podcast, particularly with respect to how they manifest through environmental disasters. These are expressions of the climate crisis that is directly a product of colonialism as it's unfolded over centuries. And we know that there is no just climate action, there is no climate justice, there is no climate-safe future worth having without justice and reparations for First Nations people and the meaningful return of land, of waters, of country. In last week's episode of the Radio Reversal podcast, we spoke in a kind of meandering way about the aftermath of Cyclone Alfred, which had mostly dissipated, but we were far from a return to normal. People were still elbow deep in river muck. People were still without power. And these are ongoing issues that I'm sure by the time this goes to air will not have fully been resolved. But in this episode, we are really lucky to be bringing you an in-depth chat with Dr. Nick Southall, who's a long-term community organiser, an academic at the University of Wollongong, author of the blog Revolts Now, and the new book, Disaster, Communism and Anarchy in the Streets. Since 2011, Nick has been really interested in the ways that communities form and mobilise and act to support each other in kind of caring and loving expressions of practical, meaningful support and mutual aid during and after disasters. And so in this chat, we talk with Nick about disaster communism as a kind of agonistic opposite to disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein puts it, drawing on the work Nick's done, that's sort of compiled in his recent book. We discuss what disaster communism is and the everyday actions by everyday people that constitute it. We talk about what it is that certain kinds of community relations and modes of organising, how they seem somehow more possible in those moments of environmental disasters, and the importance of fighting to reconfigure our relations to time so we all have more capacity to do this kind of caring and loving work that can liberate us from the structures of oppression like racial colonial capitalism, and reflect a little bit on what our orientation to the state should be in these moments of struggle, particularly in these moments of intense environmental crisis. In future shows, we're going to talk more about this last point and consider the ways that the settler colonial state seeks to co-opt, diffuse, neutralise and disband the practices and expressions of disaster communism as they appear, and the implications of that for our organising and resistance. We'll also talk more about how the solidarities that can form during moments of disaster can then be deliberately fractured along the well-worn lines of colonialism, racism, ableism, classism, cisheteropatriarchy, and more. The assertion and reassertion of crisis colonialism by a state that is very adept at demobilising transformative communities by strategically drawing some of us back into complicity at the expense of others, taking us back out of relation, out of community, and out of solidarity. But for now, in this show, we want to focus particularly on disaster communism and what we can learn from these moments where that transformation and where those solidarities are expressed and are possible. We want to pay attention to the possibilities about the kind of politics and worlds we can have that we can get attuned to by paying attention to these moments. We want to pay particular attention to what has just happened and the very real and meaningful efforts people put in to prepare their communities, to look after their communities and help recover their communities after this disaster, and how the emergent organising and existing networks and relationships expanded to meet the scale of the unfolding disaster.
We're with Nick Southall, author of an amazing new book that we're eagerly working our way through. Nick, can you tell us a little bit about this book and what led you to bring together the writings in this way?
Okay, yes. So Disaster, Communism and Anarchy in the Streets is a sort of long-term project, really. So first of all, it's a collective project. So even though I wrote most of the book and it's based on my written work, it was put together with a group of people who assisted me to edit and refine and improve the written work, and then put it together as a book to lay it out, to add images and so forth. So, yeah, I think that's important to mention first. And it's an accumulation, I had an accumulation of work over a number of years writing explicitly about disasters, and it occurred to myself and some of those who supported this project that it would be good to put them together because they were complementary, and together they would actually be more helpful than they were just individually on my blog. And so we as I say, refined them, put them together, and did that because, first of all, they were a good record of the disasters that I'd been writing about and some of the events and experiences and lessons or questions that had emerged from those disasters, but also because, obviously, we understood more disasters are coming. And so we wanted to sort of assist the thinking and practice around how we prepare for, respond to disasters, and some of the sort of join or further some of the conversations and debates about the ideas and practices of how we should deal with disasters.
For anyone who hasn't read your stuff, what is disaster communism? How do you define that term?
I came up with the term because I'd read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, where she coined the term disaster capitalism, and I found it a really interesting and important book, and was really impressed by the way she understood and explained disaster capitalism, how capital and its state forms take advantage of disasters and further them, intensify them and so exploit them and so forth. And then I read Rebecca Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell, which was sort of did what Klein didn't do in the shock doctrine, was to look at the alternative to disaster capitalism, what ordinary people at a grassroots level did in response to disasters that wasn't disaster capitalism, or was a way of both countering disaster capitalism and creating alternatives to it. And while Klein mentions that at the end of her book, it's really not the focus, and so I was really impressed with Rebecca's book. And then in 2011, when the Queensland floods hit, I became immersed in that disaster from afar and started to think about, well, what did I think about what was happening and the responses, the incredible and powerful responses of ordinary people and grassroots organising to that disaster, and then came up with this, I thought, what's the opposite to disaster capitalism? And the having been a long-term communist, I thought the obvious term is disaster communism. So it's the alternatives. It's the sort of grassroots practices, the alternative social relations of ordinary people who are responding to disaster in ways that both challenge capital and its state forms and create alternatives to capital and its state forms. So the networks of social solidarity and support that help people to survive, and also to create a variety of different ways of doing and living, the redistribution of wealth and resources and power, the sort of care and love and solidarity that arise during and after disasters.
And Nick, I feel like you're really clear on this in the book, but the importance of clarifying that you're looking at the responses of everyday people in these moments of disaster rather than looking at the responses of states or corporations, that the focus of disaster communism is not on a kind of state communism, and you counter the idea of disaster communism really clearly in the book to some of the new waves of theorising from communists who are talking about this kind of state-centric, big state kind of what you term war, or what they term war communism. And I wanted to get you to draw that out a little bit, because I think it is a really vital part of what's different about your work, that it is really directly oriented to looking at how people in their own communities respond in these moments, rather than to how states or governments respond.
Sure. And obviously a key concern of my work is always around power. And there's a lot of focus, the traditional focus of much of the left, of communists and so forth, is on the power of capital and its state forms. And while obviously that's helpful and useful, and we need to understand that as much as possible, what I think is often neglected is class power, our class power. And it seems to me that we need to spend a lot more time and energy on focusing on how we organise our own class power. So rather than spending my time concentrating on capital and what it does, and disaster capitalism and so forth, or state responses to disaster and so on, while those are parts of my work, what I want to put at the front of that, what I want to us to think more about and to try and encourage people to do more in relation to, is organising our class power as the alternative to capitalist state forms, capital, the social relations of capital and so forth. And it seems to me, that's often neglected. It's neglected by Klein in the shock doctrine. While Solnit is doing it, they're not doing it in the same way as I do it, and not as overtly about class as I'm doing it, because they have a different political perspective. But I sort of wanted to build on what Solnit was doing and use different examples to explore the way the class was actually composing itself in the period I was writing. And if we think about 2011, when I started writing, that was an incredible year of class power. I mean, there was militant revolt erupting right across the world. So it seemed obvious to me, but the tendency often is to overemphasize the power of capital, overemphasize the power of its state forms, and downplay or neglect our own power.
One of the things that I really loved about the book, and something that really struck me as we were obviously in the sort of immediate aftermath of Cyclone Alfred up here, is that you're thinking on this particular idea of disaster communism, as you've mentioned, is really tethered to both your own and other people's direct experiences of disasters, right? And I'm really struck by the way you talk about this kind of interest in how we build class power. And I guess I want to ask you what you think it is about disasters in particular that makes them such fruitful or generative spaces for a sort of reorganisation or rebuilding or resurgence of community power or class power, however you want to term it. Like, what is it that happens in those moments that kind of opens up those possibilities in new ways?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a range of things I've been thinking of, but I think it's also important when we're thinking about this question to appreciate that disasters are ongoing.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things, the sort of larger, more intense, the disasters that affect more people help us to realise is that these disasters are ongoing. They're not really events or moments. But I suppose I've done it myself in the book. I've written about those larger disasters and tried to interweave them with the sort of smaller or more everyday disasters. And I think those larger disasters, one of the things they do is they expose the nature of reality. So they make more stark our situations, and in both positive and negative ways. So we get a greater clarity about our actual situation. And a lot of the illusions or the ideologies or the pretense gets swept away. And that is helpful, right? It's helpful. A lot of the shit just is clearly just crap, and then we have to face, well, what is more real than what we're often having to deal with. I think also what we witness in these disasters is rapid and radical social transformation. That's what happens, right? I mean, there's a whole range of ways, and being up in Queensland, you're probably experiencing that in so many ways at the moment. Things that weren't happening or even considered possible last week, all of a sudden they're happening. And so the idea that things just go along, as normal, and it nothing can ever change, and nothing. Or there can't be radical change, or, there's a whole range of things that suddenly people appreciate, realise and experience as possible. And again, that's just an amazing step to take, right? Because that just, convincing people or people experiencing that is often really difficult. But increasingly, it's becoming commonplace. What people consider normal and stability is the thing that is disappearing, and the idea of rapid radical change is just common sense, right? And then it becomes a question of, well, what type of rapid and radical change? And that opens up question, much more important question. So I think those are the sort of the important things. And obviously when you're thinking about class power, which I am, in these times, however you may think of class power, and often people aren't thinking in those terms, but may be thinking about it in their own ways, the composition of capital, the composition of the class are transformed, but also those transformations and those processes and what's going on become clearer. So we're not just thinking in individual terms, we're thinking in more collective terms, and we're seeing that class power play out in really powerful ways, and that can help deepen our understanding of our current class struggles.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about strategies and what we attend to, because as you allude to, right, the nation state, the neoliberal nation state, is always trying to absolve itself of responsibility and provide as little support to people as possible. So are we better off or is it a waste of our time to be advocating for the state to provide more support? And are we focusing too much on, pressuring politicians and saying, why aren't you providing this subsidy, or why aren't you helping people in this way? Would we be better off just focusing that energy on direct, on the ground organising? Or should we actually just still be focusing on pressuring the state, but focus on challenging the regulatory barriers and the controls that make it harder to collectively organise?
Yeah, I think there are a wide variety of ways of building class power and challenging and escaping capital and its state forms. So I think the focus needs to be on building our own power, as I've said. So again, not just focusing on making demands of the state or trying to get the state to do the right thing, and so forth. And obviously, neoliberal states often not only don't address disasters and needs during and after disasters, they actually add to those disasters. They intensify them, they exploit them, and so forth. That's, disaster capitalism. Nonetheless, I do think that there are a range of capitalist state forms, and some are better than others, and that there are aspects of what states do that are often needed and can possibly be helpful. And therefore, we shouldn't
give up on it altogether.
Or let them off, right? Because if we do, the probability is that those worst state forms, the more vicious attacks on us, will be unleashed even more strongly. And so challenging the state to do the best it possibly can for us is a defensive manoeuvre. And while we're trying to build our own power and escape their power, we also need to defend ourselves against the worst aspects of the power of capital and its state forms. So I do think we can gain things from the state that can be useful to us. I do think we can make irregular use of the state's wealth and resources, which it has a lot of, and its power. That's possible. And I think while I'm saying that there should be some focus on the state, I think when doing that, what's really important is to not reproduce those state forms within the ways we organise. And I think that's often a mistake that those who focus on the state make, is that they sort of become transfixed on that power, and they think that the only way to enact power is in a similar way. And so I think that's the danger, is that we or two dangers. One, that we let them off the hook and then they just attack us, and we're not defending ourselves from that.
Yep.
But the other one is that we reproduce alternative capitalist state forms in our own practices, and we need to be very careful not to do that.
So one of the things we've seen this week, and it was an announcement today that we've been discussing a little bit on the show already, which is the Brisbane Lord Mayor, who's a Liberal National Party Lord Mayor, announcing the forthcoming immediate evictions of people who've been sleeping rough in parks in and across the City Council area. And this follows on recent announcements from Moreton Bay, the neighbouring City Council, that they were going to evict rough sleepers from local neighbourhoods. And it led us to a conversation on the show this morning about the way that there's a sort of, I guess I'm curious about the way that the boundaries of empathy maybe shift a little during disasters. Suddenly some of the sort of normative ideas about who is a threat and who isn't change a little bit. But it also feels as though we've watched here a kind of clamping down of existing the sort of existing hierarchies of whose lives are deemed to matter and who is deserving of support, even in the context of this disaster. You know, there's a way that the hierarchies and you know, modes of differentiation that have always been used to sever class power, they are working. They're doing their job. And you know, I saw a tweet this week from someone living in an affluent suburb of Brisbane who seemingly without irony said, "I don't understand why the SES responds to calls in low income areas. We pay more taxes. Why aren't they responding to our calls first?" You know, so I'm curious about, like, for you, you know, this kind of, I guess, this complicated question of like whether there's something about disasters that serves to disrupt those entrenched, you know, racialized, gendered, classed ideas about whose lives are deemed to matter, who is grievable, who is, you know, deserving of care, and to what extent those are kind of dismantled in these moments.
Yeah, and to piggyback off that, maybe, Nick, is your book too optimistic? Like, is it actually the case that as the polycrisis worsens and people feel more, you know, like they're struggling more and more, or they feel that they're struggling more and more, even if they're actually doing okay, that the lifeboat mentality kicks in and the drawbridge goes up? And so, on the one hand, disasters have the potential to provoke an outpouring of communism and mutual aid, but simultaneously that's butting against increasing sense of scarcity and desperation. Like, there are these two competing threads in society where some people are also assertively hoarding stuff at the supermarkets and taking as many sandbags for themselves and not leaving any for other people. Like, we have to acknowledge that reality as well, that people have been socialised into selfishness and individualism a bit.
Sure, and being too optimistic is I'm very often critiqued for exactly that, and have been for many years. The book is pretty clear about a lot of the, it doesn't deny disaster capitalism. It focuses on disaster communism.
Yes.
But obviously, yes, we see in disasters a range of capitalist ideologies and capitalist practices reinforced by capitalist media, capitalist states, capitalist institutions, and so forth, which roll out the traditional divide and rule tactics that target the poor, the vulnerable, the rebellious, and so forth, that target racialized communities and so forth. Of course we see that. That's those are the everyday disasters of capitalism writ large in disasters. And if you read the shock doctrine, or you follow other writers or people discussing disaster capitalism, there's been a lot of work done on how deliberate capital and its state forms are in doing this. So I don't know how sophisticated the Mayor of Brisbane is, or we've had a similar thing with the Premier of New South Wales, almost immediately once the emergency is supposedly over in Lismore, the target is evictions and targeting those who are seen to be a risk, a danger to social order and so forth. This is what happens in disasters. Capital and its state forms try to reassert control where they feel that it's been loosened. They try to counter disaster communism because communism is the main danger to capitalism. So absolutely, I haven't read Richard Seymour's new book on disaster nationalism, came out last year, but it's sort of like an updated shock doctrine for the contemporary situation, where he focuses on the rise of fascism as both a disaster but a response to polycrisis, right? And how we're all being pitted against each other by the rise of fascism, and that this isn't disconnected from the disasters we face. This is a deliberate response by capital and its state forms to increasing disaster. And so they appreciate that there will be intensified efforts to build alternatives, what I call disaster communism, and therefore they're going to intensify, hyper neoliberalism, a descent into fascism, vicious pitting of people against each other, divide and rule tactics. This is what we are seeing, and we're going to see more of it. And while I am optimistic in the sense that I think class struggle will intensify, as class struggle intensifies around disasters, it's going to intensify because we are going to increasingly face fascism. It's not naive optimism.
Yeah.
I think back to Naomi Klein's book, which starts at the birth of neoliberalism in Chile and the way that disaster is used and created there to implement fascism. This is the base. This is the history of neoliberalism. Let's not fool ourselves what we're facing, and I don't. But nor do I deny the power of the class. And I'm not looking, as some are, like people like Richard Seymour, who are pretty despairing, or others who think that, because we don't have a revolutionary party, or the trade union membership is low, or traditional forms of what is considered to be class power are less visible, that the class isn't powerful. I see it elsewhere. I understand it as occurring in new and innovative ways, and that's what I want to explore and focus on, because the dangers are real, more disasters are coming. We shouldn't, forget that. That's not an optimistic outlook. The optimistic outlook is that those state and capital reactions or exploitations of disaster will be responded to by our class power. We just need to be better organised and think more about it and develop it and be innovative and understand the realities of the world we're in.
The book is fairly unusual, I think, in the canon of more traditional communist work, in that you focus a lot on affect. You focus on love and care and grief and the kind of, the radicalising ways that people experience expanded realms of care during these moments where they realise that they've developed bonds with people that they didn't have before. And we were interviewing someone who was engaged in direct responses to the flooding up here, who was talking about, meeting neighbours for the first time, that she'd never met before in, years of living on the same street. And I think there is something really, really interesting, and I guess I'm curious about and this is, I think, not a question for you so much as it's maybe just a thing for all of us to think about, but what it looks like to take the radical possibilities of care that emerge in these moments and be vigilant about how we ensure that our care is not organised along the lines that capitalism requires it to be organised along, right? Where we are not differentiating between deserving and undeserving recipients of our care as determined by race and gender and class and nationality and disability and all of the other ways that capitalism manages its own crisis conditions by pitting us against each other. And I think this kind of leads us into one of the other things we wanted to ask about, which I think is something that's been on all of our minds this week in relation to Cyclone Alfred, but which is about time and the way that one of the things in terms of the conversations that a lot of us have been having with people over the last week and in our own experiences, the sort of temporality of disasters like this one in particular does really shift relationships to time in very interesting and curious ways. And a lot of people, when you ask them about their memories of an event like this, they reflect on having more time. They reflect on this sense of a sort of expansion of the time they have available. And that's particularly true, I think, of middle-class workers who've transitioned to working from home, who had days off work, who were, in effective lockdown. And it's really counterposed with the workers who have to continue labouring even in the midst of the crisis and who are, stocking shelves or being called in to work hospitality shifts, even though the roads are cut, But I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on whether there's something important about the way that this sort of changing temporality that many people experience during disasters, whether that has an impact on the sort of changing norms and sociality that you describe in the book, and the ways the sort of communism that becomes possible in those moments. Like, is it connected to time?
Absolutely, yes. And I do write quite a bit about time in the book and how it's transformed in all sorts of ways. The pandemic was such a powerful example of that. And I think when you talk to people about the pandemic and ask them to think back to it, time becomes a real problem, right? Because people just, how memory works and so forth just is thrown out because of the changes in temporality during that intense crisis. But yeah, I mean, time has been something I've focused on over a long time, and especially in relation to work. So capital is based on imposing labour time that it disciplines and controls, uses as a form of violence over our lives, and robs us of as much of our lives as they can get away with. And when capital goes into crisis, which it does in a sense or in different senses during disasters, some people can escape that violence and discipline and have more control, more power over how they use their time, whether they do anything, if they do something, what they do, how they do it, and so forth. And that is central to building alternatives. So if you want to care in different ways than the ways that capital demands that you care, you need the time to do it. And we have a crisis, of care, because people just don't have the time to care.
Yes.
But when they do, they can think about, well, what do I care about? What should I care about? How can I do that? How can I do that with other people so it's effective? And disasters sort of demand that you do that, right? First of all, how am I going to survive? How are the people I care about going to survive? What other people should I care about and look after? And those sorts of distinctions, the sort of class, gender, ethnic, racial divisions remain, but often they're challenged by when people start thinking about that. It's like, well, shouldn't I care for everybody? I talk about the alternative type of work to capitalist work as communist work. And the more time we have to do communist work, the more we can build alternatives to capitalism. So the struggle over time, over refusing the work of capital, even if we're, on the job or supposedly doing, what capital and its state forms want us to do, being able to refuse to do that and doing the things we want to do, the things that are actually valuable, the things that care about ourselves, other people, the environment, the world we're living in, the future, etc. That is, in many ways, disaster communism. Because, as I've said, there are the large disasters, there's Alfred, but then all of us are living through ongoing disasters. In some ways, Alfred, this disaster will not end. It will continue, especially for those most vulnerable. But there's a whole range. There are polycrises. There are a whole range of disasters that we live with all the time. The more time we have to care for, about, and with each other around those disasters, the more we can create alternatives to continuing disaster and intensifying disaster. So time is crucial, and we need to both find the time to do that, but also make the time to do that, through understanding we need to and struggling to do that together.
It's making me think of the work of lots of disability theorists and crypt theorists on crypt time, and how I was struck by how, while during a disaster like Cyclone Alfred, there is these sort of emergent networks and emergent practices of care and support that crop up, and there's also a lot that travels through existing support networks and existing relationships created by people who are, because of disability, because of structural discrimination, because of poverty, already in, to some degree, a state of crisis most of the time. And the ability to kind of mobilise through those networks, I think, can be really important and really effective. And I guess what I'm curious about is if you have any tips, any suggestions on as we sort of move out of this kind of more acute expression of crisis in Cyclone Alfred, but what we should be doing to better prepare and create support networks and webs of relation and mutual aid, and that we can build on in times of crisis, and where we can kind of, I guess, build some of the class solidarity and practices of class struggle and organisation in the slightly, the crisis never ends, but in the slightly less acute periods of crisis.
Yeah, so with a lot of my work, I try to centre love as a form of class power. So when I'm looking at the sorts of power that the class continually reproduces and deploys to deal with capitalist disaster, we're looking at care, right? We're looking at love. And it's in some ways it's obvious, right? I mean, we look at the rise of the right, and if we think in sort of general terms, what are they mobilising around? They're mobilising around hate, and they're mobilising around violence, a lack of care, a lack of love, right? Trying to destroy care and love in many ways and pit us against each other. So in some ways it's obvious what we should be focusing on is the opposite, right? But that's what the class does, day in, day out. The heart of the class is care and love. That is our main power for bringing us together and organising alternative social relations to the social relations of capital. So I think we need to appreciate that. We need to recognise that, support where it's occurring already, and build and extend it, because that is our hope for the future. It exists, and we will have to intensify it, and we'll have to better develop it, but it's real. It exists. We know it does. We all experience it. We just need more of it. We want more of it. That's what I think we need to think and act more around.
I mean, there's so many ideas I'm turning over in my mind right now, and I'm like, there's so many threads to be exploring here. But I was wondering if you could share maybe for people who haven't yet read the book, draw out one or two of those practical examples that highlight the sort of materiality of this stuff. Like what on the ground practically are people doing, or that you've seen and that you've been writing about, that's really inspired you and that you want more people to be doing more of? Like, we can talk in abstract terms about this, but what is it actually on the ground? What does it actually look like?
Well, I was thinking of asking you that question as well, Jono. I've been interested over the years in following some of the stuff the Brisbane Greens have done in relation to disasters, and I haven't really followed that in recent times or during Alfred and so forth. But I'm sure most of your listeners and yourselves are aware of a whole range of things, practical examples that are occurring possibly in their homes or in their streets, neighbourhoods, right this very minute. I have spent a bit of time thinking about Port Lismore and the responses there, and the sort of Lismore People's Assembly and Reclaim Our Recovery and the Healing Hub and a range of practical responses there. And then in Wollongong, again, the pandemic was the most intense example of that, where, at the top of my street, the servo was a distribution point for food for international students who had basically been stranded and impoverished, and the next servo up the street was distributing food as well. Where I work at the university was distributing food and goods to people. There was pay it forward meals going on. There was mutual aid, Facebook groups that were organising people sharing wealth and resources and advice and information, money, and driving people around, and it was incredible. And one of the people's favourite stories from the book is the Ruby Princess, right?
Yeah.
When the Ruby Princess is sent to Port Kembla because they've let all those privileged enough to be on the cruise ship off to go and spread COVID around Sydney and further afield. But the crew have to stay on board even though they're sick and dying. And then they're sent down here to Wollongong, to Port Kembla, and greeted by the military and the police, who try to isolate them there, bring in Aspen Medical, which is a sort of, connected to the Australian military and sort of neoliberal medical unit that they can control and refuse to let them access any other medical support, or the hospitals or the ambulances and so forth, and they're sick and dying. And the local community goes, well, that's not happening, right? You've picked the wrong port for that. And initially it's the unions and the International Transport Federation come in and say, no, we're going to care for these workers, right? You might not be, but we are. And we're going to get in contact with them. We're going to make demands on the state. You've got to give them access to proper medical facilities. If they need hospitalisation, they've got to come off the ship and get hospitalised. Everybody needs to be properly tested. We're sending thousands of care packages to them, which was done. The community organised that. All of the things we demanded, them being tested, them being able to get off the ship and get proper care, and if they wanted to return home to places like the Philippines and so forth, where the crew came from, all of those things were won by our struggle. And the crew reciprocated. They set up a GoFundMe page and raised money for the homeless of Wollongong, and said, we understand what it's like to be without a home and somewhere where we're safe and we're cared for. So we want to reciprocate. We want to give back to the community of Wollongong, to those most vulnerable in Wollongong. And when they, lots of them were sick and some died. Some left the ship, some stayed on, and when the ship left the harbour, the tugboats sort of celebrated with sort of fountains of water, and people lined the shore to cheer them as they left, and they had a big banner on the back of the ship saying "Thank you, Illawarra," because it was a beautiful, practical example of solidarity and care and love that was reciprocated in the most difficult circumstances. This was the height of the pandemic. Everybody was scared they were going to die, but that could be done regardless. The power of the class was so great.
You are listening to the Radio Reversal podcast, and that was our second episode in this little series digging into environmental disasters, climate crisis, and the political possibilities that exist in these moments of rupture. We've been speaking on today's episode with Nick Southall. If you want to catch up with Nick's work, you can find his recent book, Disaster, Communism and Anarchy in the Streets. We strongly recommend you have a read. It's a beautiful little compendium. And you can also find his broader writing at his blog, Revolts Now, which you can find on WordPress online. We're going to be back next week with more conversation on the podcast about the kind of limits and possibilities of that are unlocked during periods of crisis, and particularly during so-called natural or environmental disasters. And we'll be digging a lot more deeply into some of the threads that we've started to pull out in the show already today around the ways that states, corporations, and individuals and communities respond in these moments, the political possibilities that are opened up, and the way those possibilities are foreclosed or managed to enable the persistence of regimes of state power. So we'll leave you with another episode of Radio Reversal, the podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you about all of your thoughts on the episode so far, where you think we should go in future episodes, and we'll be back on your airwaves next week.